Welcome back to the Knife Studio. Today we're going to test 3 different brands of sandpaper for hand sanding. Yeah, I've got a package here for Lyle Royer. I'm Kyle Royer. Hey! Crazy mailman. All right guys, here's our 3 different brands of sandpaper. We have MasterPRO, Rhino Wet, and 3M. We're gonna test these 3 brands of sandpaper with these 3 pieces of heat-treated 1084 steel. These are hardened and tempered the same as a blade, and they've also been finished with a 320 grit belt finish, the same as I would do on a blade before I start hand sanding. We're over at the hand sanding testing area, and I've got my sanding stick and all the sandpaper cut to the same size so we can do our test. For my knives, I normally start hand sanding with 220 or 320 grit. For this test, we're gonna start out with the MasterPRO 220 grit. I'll be wrapping each strip of sandpaper around my stick, and then I'll hand sand until I feel it's just not cutting very well anymore, and then I'll rip a piece off and go to the new fresh piece. I'm really excited to see which one of these papers is gonna get the job done the fastest, because a lot of people don't like spending any more time than they absolutely need to on hand sanding. Let's get into it. That was absolutely insane. This MasterPRO, I had written it off as being like the lowest brand piece, but it actually cut really aggressive. We had a nice finish on this metal before we started, but still, it only took 38 seconds to sand our 2-inch area to 220 grit. And each piece, just so you know, has a scribe line marking off a 2-inch area, and that's all I'm focusing on. We're gonna go ahead and switch it up to the 320 grit and see if it does as well as the 220 MasterPRO. There we go, there's the 320 grit. That cut pretty quickly, but it didn't crazy impress me like the first grit did. Also, just so you know, I'm using Windex as lubrication for this hand sanding. Next up is the 600 grit. Something else you'll notice is every time I sand with a new grit, I'm going at a different angle to the previous grit. That way I can see all the previous grit scratches easily. The 600 felt really good and went really quick, a little bit faster than the 320 actually, which is kind of a surprise. This should be a good test going from the 600 to 1000. Beautiful 1000 grit, and it went really quick, I thought. This paper I thought was gonna be the underdog, but now I'm not sure. It might actually be pretty good. We'll have to find out after we test the next 2. Next up, we've got the Rhino Wet 220 grit. In my experience before, the Rhino Wet seemed to cut super aggressively with the coarser grits, but the finer ones seem to be lacking a little bit. We'll see if that's true or not with this test and see if it's the best. That cut super aggressively and was even a little bit faster than the previous brand we did. You definitely want to keep going on different angles every time you sand, because you really need to be able to see the previous grit scratches in order to get rid of the next grit scratches. 320 Rhino Wet, and start. That's it for the 320, now to the 600. 600 grit is where I finish almost all of my mono steel blades. So I'll do a satin finish with 600. I take all my Damascus blades to 1000 or 1500 though, so that's why we're taking this a step past the 600. 600 grit, start. Whew, there's the 600 grit finish. Got our 1000 grit ready to go. Let's start the clock. All right, there we go. There's our 1000 grit finish. That one seemed to go pretty well. We can go ahead and get a new piece of test metal in here and try the 3M sandpaper. So now we're moving on to the 3M 220 grit. 3M has been my staple for many years. I've used hundreds and hundreds of sheets of it. I'm curious to see how it does against these other 2 that I wasn't familiar with, and whether or not I'll be switching to it after the end of this test. All right, we're ready to go. Timer, Windex, hand sand. And there we are, there's our first grit done. 3M 220 grit. It felt familiar and aggressive and pretty fast feeling. Next, we're moving on to the 320 grit. Make sure to wrap your sandpaper nice and tight around your sanding stick because you don't want it to be really loose and fluffy. It'll round off your lines on your knife. 3M 320, timer start. Again, it just felt familiar. I've done so much hand sanding with this brand of paper. 600 grit, 3M. Get her wrapped up, nice and tight. Here we go. Nice and quick. Didn't have any nasty scratches or anything that had to get removed, so that went pretty well. Now our final grit for this test, the 1000 grit. I recommend taking all your Damascus to at least 1000 grit before etching because you'll just get a nicer, cleaner etch taking it to this grit. A little higher doesn't hurt either. All right, start the timer. I actually just used a whole piece and still have a little bit of a scratch, so I've got to move on to another piece of paper for this. There we go. That was kind of a surprising turn of events there. Because on the other tests, I think I only used like maybe half a piece of paper, but there I used a whole piece, plus we had to wrap up and put another piece on there. So it took quite a bit of sanding to get rid of those 600 grit marks. This 3M 1000 grit might cut a lot slower than I thought it did. All right guys, we added up all the different numbers and we have the results of the test. For MasterPRO, we have 39 seconds. For Rhino Wet, we have 33 seconds. And for 3M, we have 31 seconds, all on the 220 grit to get rid of that belt finish that was on our test metal. For the next grit, 320, MasterPRO took 1 minute and 4 seconds. Rhino Wet, 1 minute 18 seconds. And 3M, 1 minute and 8 seconds. The next grit, 600 grit, 52 seconds for MasterPRO. Rhino Wet was 1 minute and 32 seconds, and 3M was 1 minute and 6 seconds. And then for our final grit, MasterPRO at 1000 grit, 60 seconds, Rhino Wet 48 seconds, and 3M took a whopping 2 minutes and 35 seconds. All this stuff was super close together, guys, but the main difference was just that last 3M one. That's where there's like a huge difference because the rest of the results are close-ish, but that one took like more than double of any other grit. So we added up how long each brand took, and for the MasterPRO with all the different grits, it took 215 seconds total. For Rhino Wet, all the different grits combined took 251 seconds, and then for 3M, all the grits combined took 320 seconds. Let me tell you, I was really surprised by the result we had with the 1000 grit 3M because 2 minutes and 35 seconds versus 48 and 60 seconds on the other two brands was a huge difference that I was not expecting. I might want to run one more test with it though, because I feel like just looking at the difference, that 3M 1000 grit finish just seems really shiny. It seems more like a mirror finish in a way than the other two. The other two are a little more of a matte finish. So I'm wondering if the 3M 1000 grit might actually be a little finer than what they're advertising possibly, and thus why it took longer to sand. But it might have resulted in a finer finish. So what I want to do to test that out is to use some 1500 grit 3M and sand all 3 test samples and see how long they take to sand, and we'll know how fine of 1000 grit each different brand was by how long it takes to go up to the next grit with one standard paper. We also kept track of how much sanding the sandpaper brands did as well. I'm calling each section of sandpaper the amount of sandpaper that was on one side of my stick before I had to flip it over to a fresh section. So that's what these numbers relate to. So for the MasterPRO at the 220 grit, it took 3 sections of sandpaper. Rhino Wet took 3 sections, and 3M also took 3 sections. MasterPRO at 320 grit took 4 sections, and then Rhino Wet was 7, and 3M was 6 sections of sandpaper. MasterPRO for the 600 grit was 4, Rhino Wet was 9, kind of a big difference there, and then we have 6 at 3M. For the 1000 grit, we have 5 sections for MasterPRO, 4 sections for Rhino Wet, and a whopping 14 sections for 3M. It was actually enough to where I used a whole 9-inch strip up and had to get another one and put it on there and use a little bit of that too, which is part of why it took so much extra time, because I had to sit there and wrap a whole extra piece on. As far as when I would go to a new section, I basically just sanded until I felt like it just wasn't cutting very good anymore, and then I would flip it over to a new section. And I tried to do that as evenly as I could throughout the entire test. I didn't want to get everything out of the paper, just wanted to sand enough until it just wasn't cutting very good and then flip to a fresh piece. All right guys, we've got the test sample that we sanded with the MasterPRO first. We're gonna go in the same order we went before. This is all 3M 1500 grit sandpaper. Right now, like I said before, I'm only wanting to test which one of these grits is the finest, because I have a hypothesis that the 3M 1000 grit is actually leaving a finer finish than the MasterPRO 1000 grit and the Rhino Wet 1000 grit. Let's start the timer and go. All right, it took us 1 minute and 1 second to go from the 1000 grit MasterPRO finish to the 1500 grit 3M finish. All right, we've got our Rhino Wet test sample and we've got the 1500 grit 3M ready to go. Let's see how long it takes to get rid of this 1000 grit finish. Timer, start. As long as I can still see grit, I'm not gonna stop and wipe the metal off. That's what I've done on this whole test. If I can still see scratches, then I keep sanding. If I need to add more lubrication, then I'll do it. If I think I've got all the scratches out and I can't see them anymore, that's when I wipe it off and check. Oh, all right, there we go. So that took 2 minutes and 20 seconds to go from the Rhino Wet 1000 to the 3M 1500. That took twice as much time, more than twice as much time. I think it's because the Rhino Wet is like super aggressive, but it also leaves a coarser finish, which was kind of my hypothesis. And I think the 3M is the opposite of that. I feel like it's probably a little less aggressive on that 1000 grit, but it leaves a finer finish. So we're gonna prove that next by going to our 3M sample. All right, we've got our 1000 grit 3M test sample here, and I'm getting the 1500 grit 3M paper. We're gonna time how long it takes to go from this 1000 grit finish to the 1500 3M finish. And timer start now. Now. All right, there's our final test there. That actually took a little longer than I predicted because my hypothesis was that it would be easy to go from the 1000 to the 1500, but it still took a minute and 18 seconds. Here's the breakdown on this extra bonus test. Keep in mind, this wasn't testing sandpaper, this was just testing which 1000 grit left a finer finish by using one type of paper to go up another grit. And we used the 3M 1500. So for the Master, it took 1 minute and 1 second and 5 pieces of paper to go up to that 1500 grit. For the Rhino Wet, it took 2 minutes and 20 seconds to go up to that 1500 grit from the 1000, and it took 14 pieces of paper. It was brutal. It felt like I was sanding up against like a 600 grit finish up to 15, not 1000 to 15. It's what it felt like. And then for the 3M, it took 1 minute and 18 seconds to go up from 1000 to 1500 and 9 pieces of paper. These results really surprised me because in both of our categories of longevity of the paper and how quickly it'll get the job done, the MasterPRO takes first place. Why does that surprise me? Because we actually bought MasterPRO just to have a filler as a third sandpaper to test, and I completely thought it would be the underdog. It's from O'Reilly's, and it was the fastest and most aggressive paper, and by that last bonus test we did, it showed that it also left one of the best finishes out of the 1000 grit papers. In second place, we have Rhino Wet as far as how long the sandpaper lasts and how quickly it'll get the job done. The only question in my mind about Rhino Wet is how fine of a finish that 1000 grit leaves. Because with our little bonus test of sanding everything with 1500 grit 3M paper, it seemed like the finish the Rhino Wet 1000 grit left was a lot more aggressive and coarse compared to the finish the other two brands left. So that raises a big question in my mind whether or not I'd want to use it. Now last and also least in our test was 3M sandpaper. I really went into this test with a favor towards 3M because I've been using it for years and I've recommended it to tons of people and I just really love it, and I get sentimentally attached to things, so I loved 3M just because I've stuck with it for so long. So I really wanted it to win, but it failed in both how much paper it takes to sand and how long it takes to get the job done. So what does this test mean for me? It means that I'm gonna seriously look into MasterPRO, and I wanna test it a lot more and use it over time in my knives if I can get a hold of it and if I can get it in bulk, because that's also important. I don't wanna buy these little tiny quarter sheets. I wanna be able to buy it in like 50 packs of large sheets. So if I can do that, I'm gonna look into using it, and maybe I'll be able to actually recommend it after I've used it over time. But right now, we'll see. All right, guys, we're not a sponsor of MasterPRO, of Rhino Wet, of 3M, or of Windex. I will see you guys in the next video. May the forge be with you. Bye-bye.